People are losing their children to this.
Let's move now on to the core of the debate itself. Thank you for your pitches. Let me come, if I would, made to you, Rory, and ask you perhaps the central question, which I think Angus was touching on there, which is really it comes down to how we define progress. How should we define progress, do you think?
It's complicated because, as I think Angus said, that economists have looked at material conditions and probably also looked at progress also through a lens of average material conditions and have consequently missed rising inequality. Because if you have a single representative agent, there can be no inequality. So I think that's an interesting question. However, I would argue a little bit in support of Hans Rosling that there are many objective measures which you can't really suggest that the majority of people in a country like the UK do not continue to get better off in most material ways. Cultural erosion and other things are factors which, of course, we can't really quantify. And, I'm very, very ready to listen to the case which says that even though things are materially better, in some ways, family life, particularly raising children, has become unbelievably more difficult. Things that are of huge importance to people in social and sort of evolutionary terms have actually become harder, just as certain material conditions have become easier.
Only certain ones, Rory, because if you think of the number of people who use food banks in the UK, for example, at the most basic level of food, even those material needs are not being necessarily met.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, the food bank is meeting a material need. You could argue it's really quite efficient in some respects, that food, rather than going to waste, can at least go to someone who needs the food.
Well, it suggests they don't have the food they need to start with, which is the problem.
I'm not disputing that. And that I think is a function of undoubtedly growing inequality is a real thing. I wouldn't dispute Arlie's point for a second. However, the fact that the news stories we're fed, the narratives we're fed, are overwhelmingly more pessimistic than they should be, is nonetheless, I think, a fair point. Okay. So I'm not suggesting that things are entirely trending in the right direction. I wouldn't say that for a second. I entirely agree with the point about inequality and indeed deaths of despair. Nevertheless, I think that news coverage exacerbates this and therefore risks making something self-fulfilling, because everything which you start in a mindset of negativity can only get so good. It effectively limits our aspirations.
Arlie, come in on that.
Yeah. It isn't just the negative news stories and our attunement to them. What's missing, if you see what's happening, is a picture of the social logic that goes along with downward mobility. Suppose you have a town and you have offshoring of the factory, or it being automated out, which is what's true in red states. There's a downward mobility that has a whole social logic to it. It goes with more family disruption. It goes with leaving. 28 million people from 1900 to 1970 left the South and Midwest, not just because they wanted to, but because their farms run dry and there were no factory jobs. Domestic abuse, accidents are higher. And as that's part of that downwardly mobile logic, there's higher exposure to toxic chemicals, more obesity. So apart from lower life expectancy, there is a whole depressing, you would say, logic that we have to look at. It's not just news reports, it's what the news are reporting or not reporting that is depressing people.
No, I think that idea that society is bifurcated is fundamentally true. My only point is that we won't find a way out of this crisis until people start to learn to tell a few positive, good news stories.
Well, okay, let me bring Angus in on this, because I think you wanted to come in on Angus, your take, as you said at the beginning, is more concerned with pessimism. You are more pessimistic than that. But what about that point is the way it is presented? I mean, for all the goods and bads, it just depends what you're looking at. Because I guess for all the people who need food banks, there are many people who don't.
Well, Hans Rosling, bless him, died before COVID. He did see the financial crash. And I'm not so convinced that things are so great in Britain, even in the median. Median wages in Britain have not changed, not since 2007. That's a longer period than since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when handloom weavers were being put out of work. That's a really terrible, and that's a middle sign. That's not an average sign. Wages for working people, that is people without a four-year college degree in the US, are lower than they were in any date during the 1980s. And if you go back to the days of the blue-collar aristocracy, then really bad things have happened to them. It used to be that people with only a high school degree owned a half of all wealth in the US. Now it's 20. The other half is owned by people with a college degree. So I think you have this very genuine phenomenon that workers have lost out relative to an educated elite. You're not getting the deaths of despair as widely elsewhere as you're getting them in America, because you have better social institutions for protecting them. You also don't let the drug companies, the drug companies were paying off politicians to turn the other way when their constituents were dying in droves. I mean, you have problems like that in Europe, but they're just not as severe. But there's this sense in which the working class as a whole has become a flock of sheep to be sheared by corporate America. And, that's not bad reporting. In fact, it's underreporting. You can't watch a sports event on television now without being sucked into addictive gambling. And the fact that there's a little note on the bottom of every TV page saying, if you have a gambling problem, call this number. My God, you have a gambling problem because you're watching this stupid advertisement that's telling you to get in there, and people are losing their children to this. This is just awful. And this is corporate America using addiction to get rich.
Well, let me bring Rory back in on that. I mean, you've been hit with both barrels there, in a sense, against what you're saying. How do you respond?
You could argue, if you were being very cynical, that it rather suits corporate America to promote a very negative economic prognosis, because it continues downward pressure on wages, by the way. And one of the things you could certainly say, it isn't only the educated elite, although I think they are the running dogs of this. It's also effectively owners of certain asset classes have done ridiculously well over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly since the financial crisis, and have set themselves up as a kind of rentier class over, for example, typically the young in particular, for whom housing costs, even if you are in the educated elite, if you're a young member of the educated elite, 50% of your after-tax salary roughly will go in housing costs in London now. It's not only at the level of what you might call, two social classes. There's also a very big age disparity, and undoubtedly there's extraordinary kind of, I would argue, extraction of wealth from the corporate sector benefiting share owners at the expense of workers. And the negative, but in some respects, this negative story, the idea that everything's, we face constant competition from low-cost markets, has been used as a narrative to actually keep pressure on wages down.
Well, let me bring Arlie on that, because I know you want to come on that point particularly.
Yes, I'm thinking of a man I've interviewed for a forthcoming book who lives in Pikeville, Kentucky, and who could be right out of Angus's work. He is a recovering alcoholic, and his mother and father were alcoholics. Father lost his job when coal went out of the region and became depressed. So this is the son of a depressed man, and he's depressed. And he's recovering, though. And he, at age 40, he went to college, University of Pikeville, and there was a man who came in and said, I'm going to give you a lecture about the American dream. Now, all you have to do is save some money, get a bank account, and set aside a little money every month for your children's education. And this man told me, I listened to that guy's lecture on the American dream. I just wanted to tell him to shut up. You can do that. You can get that American dream if nothing else goes wrong, and everything in his life, his own personal life, fell apart and went wrong. So what is this American dream? When you look at it, it involves first the premise that you have to do better than your parent. You're a male wage earner, and hey, you should out-earn dad. Well, majority of Americans, not just the blue collar I'm looking at, can't and don't out-earn dad. And then it's all about earning. And there's nothing about being better in a way, recovering and getting better, or making fewer plastic bags to go in the ocean. Nothing about our definition of progress is messed up, and it doesn't involve care, and it doesn't involve making the whole world better. It doesn't involve evening out the effects of globalization on these two divided sectors. So it kind of calls for a redo on what we think progress is.
Well, on that point, let me bring Angus in, because I'd like to ask Angus a question. Is it not a question of the time period we're looking at? If we look really close up at any period of time, we will see ups and downs. But over, 100 years, is it not possible to say there has been progress? And we almost distort it by looking too closely at perhaps a decade or 5 years. And that is the answer, to simply look on a wider scale. In that sense, there is progress.
It's true, but it's not clear that's the answer. I mean, I once wrote a very optimistic book in 2013 called The Great Escape. And what I said is, if you go back to 1700, if you go back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and you look at where we are in 2000, I'm on the Rosling boat, I'm on the Steven Pinker boat. I mean, there's just been incredible progress over that time. But it's not just the last few years, Things have not really been very good in a lot of dimensions since the financial crisis. And the financial crisis, in some sense, was just showing that the emperor had no clothes. I mean,
I agree with that.
And that just waiting for capitalism to make everyone benefit, you're going to have to wait until the end of time. It's also true that, and I wanted to pick up on something that Arlie was saying, it's not just mortality. There's an ocean of morbidity underneath that. People's marriages are coming apart. Not, again, if you've got a 4-year BA, but if you're in the working classes, these marriages are just coming apart. And, she said something about wages, and wages are crucial here. William Julius Wilson wrote an incredibly important book about what happens when jobs go away to the Black workers in the cities in the North, and all the dysfunction that followed that. That's happening everywhere now. And without these wages, you can't form permanent unions. You get enormous numbers of people with children out of wedlock. Men may have 3 sets of kids, but don't know any of them because they're all living with, the next man that the woman moved on to. There's an ocean of pain, of lower back pain that no one really knows what it is. And every pain survey shows these numbers going up, which actually was something the pharma companies knew about pretty early on, too. There's really bad stuff out there. And that's been happening since around 1970, which seems to be
well, I think so, too. Yeah.
So it's 1970 is a while ago, right? I was 5 years old in 1970. Arlie was probably around. You two were probably not born then. So, it's not just the last few years. It's not just the newspapers whipping up this thing. There was a lot of unnoticed bad stuff going on since about 1970, which was the sort of high point of the blue collar working class.
Well, let me bring Rory in on that, because if you're measuring progress in those terms, Rory, it doesn't seem to be happening, does it?
I would argue, as a bit of a Georgist, that in fact, consumer capitalism has done quite a good job and continues to do so. But that the savings that I sometimes argue that my entire life in advertising has been a waste of time, because every single better thing that people can buy for less, the gains are actually mopped up by kind of the rent-seeking part of the economy, in particular property ownership, which seems to me a deeply unequal problem. And it always strikes me as strange in economics that all economists are agreed that rent seeking is a bad thing. But no one, perhaps apart from Henry George, ever had an idea for doing anything about it. And so I think a lot of the inequality is that there's a large part of the economy that's highly extractive. I think that at the very simple business of providing people with goods and services, that very simple consumerist part of life continues to improve, but that the wider economy has become extremely extractive.
Okay. Well, let me move the debate on a little bit. We've looked at progress in some detail, but what about the idea that a lot of it is comparable and comparative? So if we look at India, China, and Brazil, that we are better in some ways, our lives are better than they would be if we were living there, that in comparative terms there is progress in the West, and this debate is called Tears of the West. Is it, do you think, in that sense, something that we should be more optimistic about? Let me put that first to Arlie. Do you think that this is something where we need to just be more comparative in terms of where benefit is and where progress is?
No.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.